Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Bolton, the virtual host for the Myasthenia Gravis Association. We're so glad you're here and joining us this evening. I'm joined this evening by McKenna Fulton, the Community Program Coordinator, and Catherine Clemens. If you are new to the MGA, we invite you to check out our website, www.mgakc.org, to learn more about our programming and upcoming webinars and support groups. Also, following today's session, you'll receive a survey from us, and we would appreciate your feedback. All right, you should be able to put your questions in the Q&A. So feel free to drop those and we'll go through the questions at the end of the session. This evening, we are excited to have with us Kathleen Rippe, a dietitian from the General Medicine Outpatient Clinic at the University of Kansas Medical Center, as our guest speaker. Kathleen, take it away.
Hello. I'm so happy to get to spend my evening with all of you and chat a little bit about nutrition. And so with that, I will share my screen and we'll kind of get the presentation started. Okay, so overall, we're chatting about eating well. So with that, kind of the spots we're going to be looking at today, overall nutrition, kind of nutrition in specific areas, swallowing difficulty, nutrition considerations with prednisone, looking at nutrition with energy and immunity, and then also looking at our topic of weight management, overall wellness, exercise, and then how do we apply more of a plant-based diet in our lives. Kind of that first spot of overall nutrition is looking at some foods we tend to see overall in our diet might not be the best in order for symptom management with MG. So typical American diets tend to be not as high in protein. Most of our protein is going to be from animal sources, tend to not get that much fiber in our diets and tend to get a little higher fat and higher sugar and carbohydrates. Where we tend to see more of the research in myasthenia gravis is that more plant-based options for protein tend to help overall with our health and how we're feeling, and high fiber, lower saturated fat, and kind of low to moderate side of carbohydrates. All of this together we can see can help with kind of inflammation in our body and overall kind of how we're feeling in symptom management there. So with these general recommendations, what does that kind of look like food to food? And so we can see these are going to be kind of those areas we want to increase on our plate. When we're choosing protein, choosing more plant-based protein where we can, whether that's beans, nuts and seeds, tofu. A lot of times when I mention a plant-based diet, I get asked, does this mean I have to go vegetarian? Do I have to go vegan? Absolutely not. Plant-based diet means that including more plant foods on our plate, but does not mean that we have to eliminate any food that we're enjoying on our plate. So definitely there's still room for lean proteins on our plate. We want to choose more fish, chicken, eggs, things like that more often than red meat, pork, bacon, sausage, but there's still room for those things on our plate. When it comes to overall grains, we're wanting to choose more whole grains where we can. I typically think of more brown rice as opposed to white rice on our plate, or whole wheat bread rather than white bread. If there's other whole grains that you enjoy, quinoa, oatmeal, those are also wonderful to include. And then same with some of our kind of beans and legumes that have a little bit more fiber with that starch. For fruits and veggies, we really can't go wrong. I listed some of my favorites in both of these. I generally say we want to have a variety of color on our plate. So There's a lot of nutrients that we can get from fruit and vegetables, and there's a lot of overlap. So with that, want to get some in the green group and some more in that red and orange group between those fruits and veggies. But it's absolutely okay if you're looking at that list of veggies and thinking, well, I really only like tomatoes and leafy greens on that list. We're getting some red, we're getting some dark green. Those are both great ones to include throughout the week. And then other foods that are overall helpful for our health, having in healthy fats, whether that's nuts and seeds, oils, avocado, and then probiotic foods can also be really helpful, especially for noticing any gut health issues. With this list, typically yogurt tends to be the one that most people kind of reach for on that probiotic side, which works there. We absolutely do not have to be adding in other probiotic foods that are either unfamiliar to us or ones that we don't like. Yogurt can be a great one to include daily. Kind of on the flip side of this, we're looking at, so what foods do I want to limit if there's a lot of great foods to include? With that, more of our processed meats we want to limit. Some of our foods that tend to be higher in sodium tend to not be helpful for our health overall. So mostly some of our full sodium lunch meat. With that, choosing more of more convenient protein options. Low sodium lunch meats can be a good spot there, but I definitely recommend looking more on that lower sodium side. And then limiting things like hot dogs, bacon, sausage. With our starches and our carbohydrates, limiting ones that tend to be pretty high sugar. So a lot of this list tends to not surprise anyone as things that can include throughout the week, but we want to keep to a bit more of a limit there. Cakes, pastries, cookies, things on that side. With fruits and veggies, there's not really many areas we could go wrong with fruits and veggies. And so the spots we tend to limit canned fruit and heavy syrup, popsicles with a lot of sugar added to them, juices, especially if we're having like a fruit juice cocktail, like cranberry juice cocktail or other fruit juices that have that sugar added to it. And then on the vegetable side, fried veggies are that area we want to limit, which is another spot we tend to think of. That makes sense there. Overall, limiting fried foods is going to be helpful for keeping that saturated fat down, helpful for keeping overall inflammation in the body down a bit too. Now that we have kind of all of those food groups to include, the next spot is how do we include all of those on our plate? So with nutrition, a lot of things that I tend to see is, oh, we're adding in some veggies, we're having some fruit, we're choosing some whole grains. We have the right idea of what are healthy foods, but maybe that portion size on our plate isn't as helpful. Overall, I like to say this balanced plate can be a good goal, trying to do about a quarter of that plate our protein, a quarter of our plate our carbohydrate or our starch, and about half that plate our veggies if we can. If this plate is something that looks a bit overwhelming or is a bit more food than you tend to include in a week, then or in a meal, then that's kind of where that goal of trying to include 1 cup of veggies with lunch and dinner can be a great way to get in that fiber and get some of those nutrients in there. And the same with fruits per day, trying to get a cup of fruits in throughout the day. With those proteins, definitely we can include some of those leaner meats, choosing more beans and lentils and nuts and seeds, and then also choosing healthy cooking methods overall. So if we're having a lean protein, let's say we're having some fish, choosing more of a baked fish is going to be a better option for our body than a fried fish. with all of this so far, kind of general nutrition for everyone. With that, parts of this overall plate are also specifically helpful for MG, and we'll kind of chat more about those specific areas a bit later. But one spot specifically, especially on prednisone, is looking at managing blood sugar. And so this is the plate that I tend to recommend for blood sugar management. The more of that protein and the fiber we have from our veggies included tends to slow down our digestion a little bit, so our carbohydrates don't absorb as quickly and our blood sugar tends to not rise as much, especially since prednisone can make our body a little more susceptible to that higher blood sugar. So with that, looking at including a plant-based diet while on prednisone, one other spot to consider is when we're choosing those plant-based proteins. So I'm going to pop back to this page real quick. When we're including things like beans and lentils, we tend to put them in this starch group. And so when we're looking at that overall plate for helping out our blood sugar remaining stable, want to add in a little extra protein with that if we can. And that's one big spot where, yes, we want to increase our plant-based foods, but also including some of our other protein choices on our plate can be helpful, especially if blood sugar management is a goal of yours. When we're including those beans, one spot is adding in that extra meat, whether that's chicken, eggs, fish, nuts and seeds can be a great option, or like a nut and butter can be a good option there. Really maximizing that fiber, so that bottom half of the plate, making sure we're getting a lot of good veggies in there. And then another spot we tend to see is looking at including activity where we can. So we tend to see as we're including activity, our muscles are using that sugar a little bit more from our bloodstream. With activity, it might not look like 30 minutes all at once. It might look like we're getting in a 10-minute walk here, and then maybe we do a 10-minute seated exercise later in the day. And that's absolutely okay if we need to split up some of that exercise in order to be in a spot where we feel our best. We definitely don't want to be pushing ourselves in that exercise if we're not feeling up to it. Okay, so kind of going more into those specific spots with nutrition for NG. One big spot is looking at if we're having any swallowing difficulty. And this can be a spot where we can alter textures of foods on our plate. So a lot of times I like to recommend soft proteins, whether that's scrambled eggs, a lot of salads like tuna salad and chicken salad can be a great option. Some of our dairy products that have a bit more protein, like Greek yogurt and low-fat cottage cheese, can be great to include on that side of extra protein. On the carbohydrate side, going for softer textures, mashed potatoes are always a great one. Mashed peas, applesauce, fruit smoothies. Sometimes we see canned fruit can be a bit softer and easier to kind of break apart before we're able to swallow it, and sometimes can be a little easier on our stomach if we're noticing more stomach pain. Same on that veggie side. So kind of choosing no salt added if we can. I know not all veggies have a low sodium version, but that low sodium version can be helpful with limiting overall sodium and salt intake. But choosing some of those canned veggies, that canning process tends to break down some of those fibers a little bit better. So those can be a wonderful way to get half that plate of veggies in if we're not able to really handle swallowing more of those raw veggies or tougher fibers from salads or things like that. And then even with other veggies, if we don't want to go that canned option, choosing the freezer bags of veggies and having them well cooked, or cooking from raw and just making sure they're pretty soft and well cooked, well steamed. Um, Roasted veggies can be a good option too. Sometimes they get some of the little crispy bits that are a bit harder to swallow. So I usually recommend more of that steaming or boiling side for veggies to get a bit softer texture. When including smoothies, usually that formula I like to think of is having that liquid and then really maximizing the nutrients we can get in there. So having some fruit, having some veggies, and a little bit of protein. This can be a great way to include three groups that are a little bit harder to swallow in a way that's a bit easier. Um, Sometimes we see with the more difficulty swallowing, we're getting a bit more of those starches and carbohydrates. We have enzymes starting in our mouth to break down our starches. So if you've ever held like a Ritz cracker in your mouth and you left it there, you notice it might start to dissolve a little bit. Our body doesn't do that for our proteins. I can't hold a piece of chicken in my mouth and it dissolves as it stays there longer. So sometimes blending that up into the smaller particle sizes can be a bit easier for us to swallow, as well, a little bit easier for our stomach to digest and pass on to our intestines there. And then nutrition with prednisone. So we kind of mentioned a little bit of, okay, how do I include that plant-based diet? How do I increase more things like beans or lentils or other plant-based foods if those are some proteins that can raise blood sugar? So with that, kind of keeping those same notes we mentioned before, including as many of those veggies as we can for fiber. That can look like some well cooked veggies that can any texture that works well for you. Adding a little bit extra of those meats, adding in some more of those healthy fats. With blood sugar management, we want our plate to be that quarter protein, quarter carbohydrate, half that plate veggies. That's usually our goal for breakfast and lunch. Uh, I know for me, I usually don't get veggies in at breakfast, and most people that I chat with also don't get many veggies in for breakfast. And so, kind of that spot we look at for blood sugar management with breakfast and snacks is just thinking, how do we pair a little bit of protein with that starch we're including? And so, this page kind of goes over some snack ideas. So, some can be a starch with a little bit of protein. Some of it could be a starch with some fat or some extra fiber, like sliced pears with nuts. That's a great one where we're including a carbohydrate with a lot of fiber with a food that has more fiber, protein, and fat. If nuts are a texture that doesn't work that well for you, absolutely fine. We could do more so like a peanut butter with a fruit could be a great pair, or having some veggies with hummus can be a great option. Looking at whole grain cereals like Cheerios with Greek yogurt could be another great option as well, where we're choosing that carbohydrate that digests a little quicker, paired with a protein that doesn't take as much, kind of physically breaking down that texture there. One spot I like about this page is kind of at the bottom, including some of the sweets and the chocolates, especially with Halloween later on this week. I feel like a lot of times when blood sugar management's a goal, we kind of think, oh, I can't have any type of candy, I can't have any type of sweet. And while we want to limit it a bit there, it's still an option we can include on our plate. So I always like to say, including like a fun sized candy bar or some pieces of small chocolates and then pairing that with something that helps digest it a little bit slower. Another spot to look at with nutrition is if we can we can know what to put on our plate. We can know, yes, I want to include lean proteins. Yes, I want to include a lot of veggies. Yes, I want to do some whole grains. But sometimes by the time we get to dinner, it can be a spot where we really just don't have the time or the energy to include that. We might not have the time or the energy to include some of that grocery shopping. We might just need a quick option to heat up. So overall, for some quick meal ideas, there's a couple options. There's some meal delivery programs as well as some that kind of cut out that planning and shopping side of it. So some things like Every Plate, Blue Apron, HelloFresh are ones that tend to ship more of the ingredients to you. It still takes a little bit more prep time. With things like Every Plate, Blue Apron, HelloFresh programs like that, is they're all good options. They all have kind of different meal plans to choose from. So there are some that might say, I want to choose more healthy meals. So they will provide meals to choose from that are around that 500 calorie spot. Or it might be, I want to choose more plant-based meals or vegetarian meals. It might be, we're going to kind of switch it up week to week on that side. There's no kind of direct right answer there. Some weeks it might make more sense to look at some of those plant-based meals. Some weeks it might make sense to look at more of the lower calorie meals. Those are both spots that you can include. I always recommend kind of checking that nutrition information of a dish before adding it to a cart. Sometimes dishes we might think, oh, that's a great plant-based meal. It's like a baked tofu with some mashed potatoes and roasted broccoli or boiled broccoli. Um, and even though it has a lot of great ingredients in there, kind of that calorie side can add up. So I always recommend both looking at those ingredients and that portion size overall. With Kansas City, there are some local options of pre-made and pre-put together meals to heat up. Kitsch is a company in Overland Park and Prairie Village that has pre-made meals to heat up. A lot of times, another option I'll recommend for quick prep is having some frozen meals on hand. With frozen meals, they can range widely in how nutritious they are. There's a lot of them out there that are really high in salt. I usually kind of think of that Marie Callender's pot pie as the frozen meal I always think of, and that's one that has quite a bit of salt that might not be as great for our health long term. And so with that kind of looking at meals, if we're choosing frozen meals to be ones that have a bit of fiber, tend to stay at a good carbohydrate range. If we're watching our blood sugar, usually that's going to be looking at under 60 grams of carbohydrate per meal. Choosing ones that have textures that you enjoy as well. So some of the like veggie bowls could be a great option. A lot of times they can steam so that the veggies are a softer texture. But if it's one that takes too much chewing and is a little bit difficult with swallowing, that might not be a great option there. Um, Frozen meals are something that can also be a blank canvas. So if we're looking at a like mac and cheese frozen meal, but it doesn't have that much protein in it, sometimes I'll say we can add some like canned chicken in there to get a little extra protein, or maybe add in some canned beans into a meal to up that protein and up that fiber a little bit. For preparing kind of that whole meal and quick options, one tip I love this time of year is bulk prepping soups and casseroles, especially prepping soups with canned veggies, frozen veggies, and pre-cooked options. A lot of chilies are a great option where we just open a bunch of those cans and kind of add them all together. And we can make a large portion and freeze it. So later on, if we're having a really busy day, a lot of doctor's appointments, something where we are getting home at the end of the day and just tired and not having that energy to cook, we have something in the freezer that we can go off of. One of my other favorite ones to include is having a pre-cooked protein source, whether that is a rotisserie chicken in the fridge, whether that's canned beans, whether that is a pouch of flavored tuna, and then adding in some quick cook options like frozen veggies steamed really well, and maybe the little baggies of the microwavable rice. That can all be a great option to portion out onto the plate where we can still have that half plate of veggies, quarter plate carbohydrate, quarter plate protein, and it doesn't take much prep time outside of putting something in that microwave and adding it to our plate. We can also think of meals as it does not have to be one whole cohesive idea. So sometimes I'll say, think of those separate food groups. It might be for carbohydrate, we have some whole grain crackers. And then for that protein, we say, I'm just going to add some cheese with it. And maybe I have a cup of Greek yogurt as well to get a good amount of protein at that meal. And then when we're looking at veggies, maybe we say, okay, I'll do some steamer veggies. And even though might not think of that as a kind of meal idea put together, thinking of it more like a large snack or two separate halves of that plate to include can sometimes make it easier than thinking, okay, what all do I have to prep and prepare for this meal? And then kind of on that side for energy, nutrition for helping our immune system and energy, one of the biggest spots is avoiding undereating. And this can definitely be a tricky spot if we're kind of in that situation I was mentioning on the last slide where maybe we had a really long day full of appointments, maybe we're getting home late and it is just don't have that energy to eat. So we might say, oh, I'm just not going to have anything for dinner tonight. I'll just something for breakfast tomorrow morning. When we're under eating consistently, it makes sense that our body's not going to feel as energized there. Our nutrition is fuel for our body. And so, in order to keep that energy up, we want to try and make sure we're maintaining that 2 to 3 meals a day with snacks. One other spot that I didn't mention on that last slide, but can be a swap for snacks or meals are protein shakes like Boost Plus or Ensure, or Walmart has a great brand version of it. Their Equate Plus is the same nutritionally as Boost and Ensure, but a little bit cheaper. And those can be really good options if we feel like, man, I'm having an off day. I am not wanting to include I just can't cook anything. So I'm going to grab a Boost Plus and I'm going to try and get a little more food intake tomorrow. With protein shakes like Boost, Glucerna, things like that, if we're watching our blood sugar, a lot of times we'll choose more Glucernas or Boost glucose control in those times, or shakes that are specifically meant for managing blood sugar. And those are definitely really helpful, especially paired with a meal. Some of those shakes that are made for managing blood sugar are lower calorie because they don't have that sugar in there. So absolutely great to include like a Glucerna or a Boost glucose control if we're pairing it with a snack where we have a little extra food with it, or if we're having it just as our snack in the day. But if we're more on that side of needing to replace a meal, that's where I always recommend that Boost Plus or Ensure Plus, because we need to make sure we're replacing enough calories from that meal. And even then, that Boost Plus and Ensure Plus they're higher in carbohydrate, but they're still on par with what carbohydrate should be for a whole meal. So the plus versions might not be the best to pair with other food to have as a drink on the side, but they can definitely be helpful to as a meal replacement at the end of the day on days we're feeling lower energy. Then kind of more on that immunity side. I know I've mentioned a lot of getting in fruits, getting in vegetables. Part of that is just the vitamins that they're rich in and how they can support our immune system. So a lot of times we hear vitamin C to help against colds. It's still good to have vitamin C intake if we don't have a cold or if we're not feeling sick. We see vitamin C acts as an antioxidant in our body. So that's something that can help prevent damage to our cells in our body. So some of those foods that are really high in antioxidants, dark leafy greens, I tend to think like kale, spinach more so than like iceberg lettuce, oranges, berries, pomegranates. We usually think of antioxidants with more of those deeper colors like blues, purples, dark greens. And then I mean tomatoes and whole grains have them as well, even though they're not those fun colors. With this list, if these are fruits and veggies that you do not enjoy, absolutely okay. With vitamin C, potatoes are a great source of vitamin C. And that's one that I feel like some people are surprised to hear about because we usually think, oh, citrus and fruit is going to be that source of vitamin C. But a lot of our vitamins, and I said this earlier, have a lot of overlap between those fruits and veggies. So if we're not a big fan of citrus fruits, or if we have some acid reflux issues where we just can't handle oranges and lemons and tomatoes, then including things like berries, potatoes can be a great way to get some of that extra vitamin C in. Okay, so then kind of shifting that focus more so from what's on our plate to overall wellness. One big spot I like to include overall wellness is general mindfulness as well. So we sometimes think about our the other side of nutrition just being exercise, but we also see getting a good night of sleep, limiting stress as much as we can also have a big impact on our body. They have an impact on our weight as well as our overall well-being. We tend to see if we're not getting that good amount of sleep at night, having enough sleep helps our body with keeping our hunger hormones in check as well. So sometimes if we're consistently getting low sleep, that's a spot where sometimes we just feel hungrier day after day because our body's having a hard time managing and replenishing those hunger and fullness cues that tell our brain when we're full and not. Same side with that mindfulness. We see a lot of with the power of thought, there's a lot of benefits there. So sometimes even just thinking of any activity as exercise. There have been some studies that have looked at including some housework. And the more we kind of think to ourselves, oh, this is my activity that I'm getting, and I'm my leg muscles as I bend down to get clothes out of the dryer, and I'm more of my back whenever I'm pulling dishes out of the dishwasher. And keeping that mind connection and truly thinking about it, we tend to see helps those muscles perform a bit better. And we see are more active when we're thinking about the activity that we're doing. We're more active on that kind of muscle cell level. With activity, anything can be activity that gets us moving. It does not have to be intense. A lot of times for activity, I like to recommend utilizing modified options. And so that could be if we're doing strength training using like a light resistance band and doing seated options, or even there's some leg exercises where we can be laying on our bed with a resistant band and our muscles to push it further towards us or away. And those can be really great options because then if our muscles are getting tired, it is a lot easier to reduce that tension from a resistance band than it is if we're holding some dumbbells and then we have to find a way to drop them off without hurting ourselves. So I always love recommending resistant band activities, seated workouts. There's a lot of seated workout resources that are free on YouTube. Three accounts that I really like to recommend are Yes to Next is one that has two people doing the exercises. They do a great job of showing here's what the exercise could look like, and here's that modified version if we're needing to make some of those modifications. A lot of times when we're making modifications in workouts, we're still using those same muscles effectively. We're just not putting extra stress on other parts of our body. The other two resources are ones that are aimed more towards an active older adult group, but they're still effective exercises for any age. And those accounts are Senior Fitness with Meredith and then More Life Health Seniors. Usually just even typing into YouTube seated exercises or seated strength training or quick balance exercises can pull up some of those videos though. Okay, and then kind of on that weight management side. So I know there's been a couple bits and pieces throughout that have tied into weight management. Kind of spots we tend to look at. One big spot that's not on here, but that we have mentioned so far is that blood sugar management side as much as we can. Being on prednisone is also a spot where we tend to see our body see some undesired weight gain while being on prednisone, in addition to a little more resistance towards our body's insulin, and we see our blood sugars increase a little bit. So, on that side, having that balanced plate is a great way to help manage that blood sugar. Also, a good way to include a lower calorie diet where we can. So, one spot I always like to recommend for anyone with a goal of weight management is including lower calorie, high fiber, or high volume options. And so things like cucumbers, carrots, the bags of air popped popcorn. I tend to recommend the pre-popped bags more so than the microwave bags, just because those microwave bags have a bit of oil in there so it can heat up and pop those kernels. But that's definitely a spot where we can see a little bit more calorie intake from that oil. Rice cakes can be another spot where we can get a larger amount of food at a lower calorie amount. The foods that we want to try and limit are some of those foods that are higher in fat. So foods that are higher in fat have more calories for a smaller volume. That being said, it doesn't mean we have to avoid foods that are high in fat. They definitely have a place on our plate. Foods that include some of that fat can help balance out our carbohydrates to help keep our blood sugar in check. But we want to make sure we're not overdoing portion sizes. So with portions, we want to keep nuts and seeds closer to that eighth of a cup to a quarter of a cup. When we're choosing dairy, where we can, choosing low fat dairy, choosing proteins, more chicken and fish over bacon, sausage, red meat with those other meats. Also, we can have them throughout the week, but keeping those kind of more to like a once or twice a week type of choice where we choose plant-based proteins, chicken, fish, beans more often. And then one of the spots that with management that seems a little counterintuitive is that avoiding undereating side. So sometimes we see with if we're eating too little of calories, that can definitely be a spot where our body goes into starvation mode a little bit. And then our body kind of tells us, I don't know where the next food's coming from. I'm going to hold on to all the weight that I have. So making sure we're keeping in that pattern of 2 to 3 meals a day with some snacks in there, and then keeping that balanced plate as well. Okay, so that kind of wraps up what I have so far. I'm gonna open up the Q&A box. Let's see. Okay, so overall with questions, so I mentioned that they're surprised to not see kale on that vegetable list. With that, kale's a great vegetable to include if that's one that you enjoy. It fits into that kind of dark leafy green area. So kind of when we were mentioning foods that can be helpful on that energy and immunity side, kale can be a great option for being a little more nutrient rich. Also works in getting that variety between some of those green and some of those red and orange veggies. So another spot that we can see when increasing fiber intake is how that affects our GI tract. So a lot of times when we're noticing more loose stools with increasing fiber intake, that's a spot where we want to look at altering some of those textures and looking at some foods that can help thicken our stools. So with fiber, we have two different types. We have our soluble and our insoluble fiber. With that insoluble fiber, I always think of like celery, where it's a tough fiber that tends to draw water into our gut and kind of push things along a bit faster. So if we're noticing any GI issues on the side of loose stools and diarrhea, that might be a spot where limit some of those tougher textures of fibers. We might look to do fruits and veggies that are peeled. So we take off that tougher fiber. We might include things more like applesauce, bananas can be great ones just because they have pectin in them that can help hold our stools together a bit more. Potatoes, peanut butter, white rice can be ones that hold our stool together a bit more as well. With that, when it comes down to fiber, when we're increasing it, we always want to increase it slowly. If we are having one fruit and veggie a week and we're increasing that to doing a cup of fruit daily and 2 cups of veggies daily, that can definitely be a big change there where we want to slowly increase that and then altering textures where we need to. If we find that more blended textures of fruits and veggies and smoothies are helpful to limit loose stools, that you can definitely see that that altered texture sometimes plays a big role in not pulling as much water into our gut and leading to more of those loose stools there. Sorry, I'm working through the questions. So let's see, one question was, is it wise to take some medications with a full meal as opposed to just a snack? That's one as well where it can vary a bit person to person. Some people tend to feel like the more food that's in their stomach with medications just makes them feel more nauseous. Sometimes we see that having more of that food in there, so it's not just our medication in our stomach acid, can be more beneficial to our gut. So I would say that's more of a question of based on how you feel on whether taking it with a snack or a meal. Let's see. And then kind of with nutrition and prednisone with moon face associated with prednisone. So definitely moon face with prednisone is one of those side effects that I haven't met anyone that is excited about that side effect with prednisone. Kind of what we do where we can with the nutrition side is there's no guarantee that nutrition will reduce that side effect and seeing more of that bloating in our face. On that side, nutrition can, I think of the best way to word this. With kind of building our plate to help manage our blood sugar with prednisone, we can limit those side effects as much as we can, but that's the spot that varies a bit person to person. Some people might see some more of that reduction in moon phase. Some people might not see as much of a change there, but might see more of that change in blood sugar management. So it's definitely one of the trickier spots where I wish I had a better answer of how we can reduce moon phase with prednisone, but kind of where we're at currently is it's just a lot of that unwanted side effect there. Let's see, another question, or at least another comment, which is good, is being careful reheating rice. So with bacteria development in rice, it is definitely something where we don't want to make a large batch of rice at once. So or at least large batch and leaving it sit out, or even sometimes in the fridge, we don't want to let it sit in the fridge too long. So I always recommend if you're making a larger batch of rice, freezing it or utilizing the little microwave pouches. A lot of times the microwave pouches, the like 90-second ones, tend to be closer to that 2 to 3 servings of rice in there. So it might be one where we're not able to get through all of those servings in a timely manner, or it might be one where we heat it up in the microwave, have our serving, and freeze the rest of it. But that's a kind of good spot to bring up on always being careful with not leaving rice sitting out at room temperature for more than that 4 hours, and then not keeping it in the fridge for too long either. So another question is, are bananas a good choice to help with foot cramps at night? With that, so we're kind of looking at potassium and foot cramps there. With foods that are high in potassium, bananas are a great option. Potatoes are a great option, high in potassium. Sometimes we see that we might need more minerals than just potassium. So bananas are a good one to include, since if you're also watching blood sugar at the same time, that's one where I'd say pairing bananas with some nut and seed butter or nuts and seeds, if that's something that does not irritate your throat when swallowing. Just because we also see a lot of nuts and seeds are going to have a lot of magnesium in them as well. So potassium can definitely help with some muscle cramps. Sometimes we see we need a little extra magnesium with it as well if you're already eating foods high in potassium and not seeing any relief with those muscle cramps. Let's see, sorry, I think I lost my spot in the questions. One of the questions is there a cookbook that can help? That is a great question. That's something I can definitely look into a little bit more and send those resources out to Catherine, Sarah, and McKenna. And then a good idea for a quick breakfast. So when we're thinking of overall breakfast, I think at minimum we want some protein and some carbohydrate. And so kind of a quick breakfast there. I'm a fan of oatmeal. So even having oatmeal with some hot water, adding in a spoonful of nut butter, or adding in some nuts and seeds, or we could add a scoop of protein powder to get that extra protein. If you're someone that likes hard-boiled eggs, a hard-boiled egg can be a great protein source with a fruit, or hard-boiled egg with a little bit of a whole grain cereal like Cheerios can be a great question there, or a great option there. Overall, kind of thinking protein plus carbohydrate. Greek yogurt's also a great one. That's a low prep option in the morning. That's already a pair of protein and carbohydrate together. With doing more plant-based proteins, I feel like breakfast is one of the harder meals for some plant-based proteins, unless we're doing like oatmeal with a pea protein powder in there. Speaking of plant-based proteins, how do you get enough protein on a plant-based diet? So that's a really good question with getting enough protein in. So a lot of times if we're going completely plant-based, like we're excluding any eggs, dairy, meat, it can be a little harder to make sure we're getting in enough protein. It's something that we try to monitor a little bit more closely. That's a spot where getting enough protein on a plant-based diet, we absolutely can still include other sources of protein. And I usually recommend still including some meat, some dairy, some eggs in the day on a plant-based diet, but just including some plant-based foods in there as well. And so that could be adding some beans with our ground turkey. That could be just increasing the fruits and veggies we're having on our plate. It absolutely does not have to be going and having a completely vegetarian meal. That could be an option where you say, oh, it's my goal to have 2 vegetarian meals a week. That can definitely be a great option, but it absolutely does not have to be every single dinner is vegetarian or every single day I'm only eating plant foods. Having that variety can definitely be helpful to get different vitamins and minerals, since things like B12 and iron we tend to see a bit more of in our animal-based foods and dairy and eggs. Okay, so the next question is juicing. So juices are a great question there. The question I hear a lot of, well, I'm not a big fan of veggies. How can I still include those nutrients? When we're looking at juicing veggies, we're getting those nutrients, but we're not really getting that fiber. So it's it's not a it's not a bad thing to include juiced veggies, but part of the benefit of including more vegetables in our diet is getting a little bit more of that fiber. It also can definitely depend how our GI tract is. So if we're noticing, hey, the medications I'm on are giving me some more loose stools to get those nutrients in my veggies, it might be better for me to juice them. That absolutely makes sense there. If we're noticing more on that side of constipation, that might be a spot where getting that extra fiber in from those tougher veggies can be helpful. Spots that I like to include some of those tougher veggies like kale, cucumber, celery is either like a grating celery in a soup can be a great way to soften it a lot. Kale and spinach and leafy greens in soups or even cooked, wilting a lot can be a lot easier to tolerate, or blending them up in a smoothie. I tend to recommend more smoothies than juices just because we're able to maintain that fiber side. Um, and then we have some questions kind of about how to include some veggies. Um, so some veggies that are a little bit tougher in texture, like kale is one that's come up a couple times today. That's one where it's a bit easier for our body if it's cooked. A lot of times cooking, blending, pureeing, canned veggies, those processes can help break down some of the fibers and some of the cell walls in those foods. We can still digest those nutrients even if they're not well cooked. We might want to chew them pretty well in order to break down some of those fibers a bit more. Let's see, another question is about, do chia seeds have a lot of nutritional value? Chia seeds are a great option to add to things. So they have a good amount of fiber. They have a lot of omega-3s in them, so they're full of all those healthy fats that are related to reducing inflammation. So chia seeds are a great option to include. And I like to sprinkle them on yogurt or mixing them into smoothies. I like to top them on different foods. So there's no right or wrong way to include chia seeds. Let's see. So recommendations for daily calorie amounts. With determining your daily calorie amount, it can be a really tricky spot just because everyone's body's a little different. And so even like a general recommendation for men versus women can be very different. I usually tend to say for most people, we want to avoid being under that 1200 spot. That being said, if you're someone that are like 4'11", you're on that more petite side, it might be a little under that 1200 spot as a happy spot for your body to be at. Most general calorie ranges for people to be in are going to be somewhere in that range of 1200 to like 2400. Usually more on that 2000 to 2400 being some taller men on that side, since men tend to have higher calorie needs and tend to be taller than most women. I feel like most women I've chatted with are kind of in that range of closer to like 1400 to 1750, 1800. So it's with calorie needs, I can't give a great answer to everyone's specific calorie needs. But somewhere in that range and kind of where you feel your best, but also are able to see those results. Other questions, overnight oats. Someone suggested as a great option to get fiber in for breakfast. That's a great way. Another kind of spot where it's a pretty good blank canvas. We can add extra protein to that. We can add chia seeds to that. We can add nuts and apples to that was another option. So that's a great kind of a great idea there. Oh, okay, here we go. A question about more quick ideas without a lot of prep with PKU as well. That is one that I might look into a little bit more and send additional resources, or if that's okay. Okay, any on-the-go meals and snacks. So meals and snacks in general, I kind of think carbohydrate and protein. And so some of my favorite combos, trail mix is a nice carbohydrate protein mix altogether. I feel like nuts are always my good go-to protein on the go, since so many proteins need at least refrigeration recently. Another one that I really like is the little applesauce pouches, and a string cheese stick can be a great pair. I might kind of scroll back here to that page that had all those snack ideas. Now, some of these are kind of more on that side of not easy to take on the go for like back-to-back doctor's appointments. With that, it might be also kind of looking at, sometimes I'll recommend taking like a small ice pack with you, depending on how long you're out. If it's, I'm going to a doctor's appointment and then it's about lunchtime, and then I have another appointment where we might not be away from home for long enough to need an ice pack, then absolutely not necessary there. But if it's one where it's like, okay, I have a drive to get to my doctor's appointment and then I'm there for a couple hours and then I have a drive home, where it might make sense to bring an ice pack there to have some more food options on that side. With kind of meals on the go, I'm always a fan of including the shelf staple packets of like tuna or chicken, mixing that with, if you're somewhere that has a cafeteria, I always tend to take a couple of like the pre-packaged little mayonnaise packets to open and squeeze in there and mix up, and then some crackers with that can be a great combo. Let's see. Coconut water for increasing potassium. Coconut water can be a great way to add extra potassium. Coconut water is very rich in potassium. The um, one spot I will say with potassium, for most people, great idea to increase potassium or include potassium-rich foods. For anyone that has any kidney issue or has a nephrologist that advises them to limit potassium, then definitely that's a spot where we wouldn't want to include coconut water. We'd want to limit bananas, potatoes, some of those higher potassium foods. But if you don't have kidney problems, or even if you have some kidney problems but don't have any advice from your nephrologist to limit potassium, then some of those potassium foods can be good to include, especially if you're noticing some more muscle cramps. Let's see. And then, so fruit and veggie powders to mix into drinks. That's kind of the same spot as juicing in terms of my answer, where it can be a great way to get extra vitamins and minerals, especially if you're in a spot where you feel like I cannot include more fruits and veggies. They are rough on my stomach. And so getting in some of those nutrients, fruit and veggie powders can be helpful, but they don't replace fruits and veggies in an overall healthy diet. Let's see. And then, so daily probiotics. So I know the three I listed on there, sauerkraut, yogurt, and kimchi. There are many other probiotic foods. So I didn't have as much space on that little column to add more. I always say like choosing your favorite probiotic foods, or if you're not a probiotic food fan, including a probiotic supplement can be helpful. There's a lot of different probiotic supplements out there, and there's a lot of advances in probiotic supplement technology as well. It used to be where only ones that were refrigerated were ones that were good for our guts. And so there's been kind of more advancements in some of the shelf stable ones that are a bit more cost effective can be helpful. I tend to recommend the Walgreens brand ones most often just because they tend to be the most cost effective for how many pills of probiotic, or how many pills you're getting out of it. Um, on the side of probiotic foods, things like miso, kefir can be helpful. Kombucha also tends to fall into that spot, but that can definitely be one where we see a little bit more added sugar in there for the probiotic. Um, and so kind of depends on what probiotic foods you enjoy. And then fiber supplements, Benefiber and Metamucil, those can also be ones that are helpful depending on what's going on with your gut. So Metamucil, I mentioned a bit earlier, kind of the types of fiber, that insoluble and soluble fiber. Metamucil is a mix of both of those fibers, where Benefiber is just soluble fiber. So sometimes I recommend that if you try Benefiber and you notice, oh, my gut's not reacting as well to this, still keeping an open mind with Metamucil and seeing if that's something that I can help regulate the either texture of bowel movements, if that's something that you're struggling with there, or also if it's just a way that you want to get in more fiber in your day, that can also be helpful to take a fiber supplement that way. Let's see, and then so kind of, oh, so I keep saying nuts and seeds, but I haven't mentioned any specific nuts and seeds. With nuts and seeds, they they're not too different in terms of nutrition. Yes, there are some that have a little bit more magnesium than others, some have a little bit higher fat content, but generally with nuts, they're all similar enough that I tend to say including whichever nuts you enjoy the most and choosing unsalted or lightly salted. Usually the lightly salted, especially if you're someone that can't do the unsalted version, the lightly salted can be a nice middle ground of still pretty low in sodium, but still having that flavor of a little bit of salt. And the same with some dairy as well. If you're someone where you say, oh, I absolutely can't handle skim milk, but I could maybe do 1% instead of whole milk, that's a great swap there. With milk too, one spot that I generally like to say about milk is whole milk tends to be advertised as that vitamin D milk. So even if you are choosing like a 1% or a skim milk or a 2%, those all also have vitamin D in there as well. So if you're choosing that whole milk in terms of getting in that vitamin D, we'll still get that in from that 1% or other types of milk.
I want to honor everyone's time, so I think we have time for one more question, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that works. I'm sorry, I've been just like going on with questions for a little bit.
Thank you so
Um,
much.
yeah, I think the last question I'll answer is kind of suggestions of protein powders to put in smoothies. Protein powders are another spot where taste is a big factor. And so if you are someone that I'll take a step back there. So it's another one where I say if you try one protein powder, I wouldn't say to write off all protein powders. So there are some people that just prefer whey protein powders. Some people prefer the taste of pea protein powders. I like collagen protein powder just because I feel like it has the least strong flavor to put in a smoothie. So I tend to recommend that one as one to start with, but it really depends on taste preference. There's not too much of a difference there. On the side of including more plant-based protein, pea protein powder could be one to kind of reach for on that side as well, since we see the research with MG is, as I've mentioned, kind of throughout the presentation, more of that research is showing, oh, more plant-based protein and plant-based diets, we tend to see some more symptom management there.
Thank you so much for your time today, Kathleen. I
Yes,
think
thank you
this
so
was,
much.
yeah, incredibly valuable. We're getting a lot of comments. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'm happy that I could spend my evening with you guys.
All right, and thank you everyone else for attending. We will be posting this on our YouTube page.
All right. Take care, everyone. Good night.